As housing insecurity in the U.S. continues to worsen, social housing, a longtime pillar of stable, affordable housing in other parts of the world, has found new momentum for reimagining housing development in the United States. Social housing proposals are a critical pivot away from a long history of American housing policy, which has prioritized home for profit, designed racial disparities to support that profit seeking, and has increasingly concentrated decision making power for investors instead of residents. Over the next 2 years, California will study social housing models and propose strategies for realizing housing justice across the state. Our report, Social Housing in California, offers a three-part framework for evaluating the varied social housing models. The first principle we consider is how to protect housing as a social good and prioritize its social value as a home instead of as a vehicle for profit. Our second principle applies social and racial equity lenses to develop targeted strategies for meeting the particular needs of different communities and residents. Lastly, the principle of participatory governance builds out processes for residents to collaborate in housing development and management decisions. Together, these three principles reimagine the role of public investment in housing infrastructure. Each of these policies intersect and implicate a wider network of public and private actors to operationalize housing as a human right. Protecting social good includes policies that preserve the public interest through deed restrictions and forbidding any future sale to a for-profit owner. Financing strategies would aim to serve a mix of incomes at scale and use a progressive source of subsidy to serve those most vulnerable to housing insecurity but least able to pay. Social housing might also include provisions for decommodifying all phases of development to limit profit seeking during project financing, construction, and maintenance. For example, robust tenant protections can help defend against profit-driven evictions. The social and racial equity principle considers targeted policy mechanisms to meet the state's goal that every Californian has a safe, stable, and affordable home. Targeted strategies take into account the particular needs and aspirations of different residents, including people with disabilities, families of color, queer households, rural residents, and others. A critical tool for social and racial equity is aligning the mix of incomes across developments to be proportional with the mix of incomes in the state. In California, this means 1/3 of the units must serve very low-income residents. Historically, public policies and private practices have blocked housing access for people of color. Race-conscious equitable design encompasses an array of defensive and proactive policies to expand access to housing security. For example, right-to-return tenant preference policies prioritize residents whose families were impacted by urban renewal or redlining. Equitable design also requires building new housing in neighborhoods to challenge existing patterns of segregation, exclusion, and disinvestment. A both-and siting approach invests in high-opportunity areas as well as in historically disinvested areas. Any social housing investments then can be paired with other infrastructure investments, such as transportation, environmental mitigation, energy, streets, and education, to improve access to opportunity. The third principle of participatory governance redefines what it means to be a renter and incorporates authentic opportunities for residents to make decisions affecting their home and community. Mechanisms for equitable participation and community building transform the experience of renting to share a type of control and power usually reserved for traditional single-family homeowners. Participatory governance takes place during each phase of planning, developing, and operating social housing. Different stakeholders and impacted communities play varying roles throughout the process. Resources for equitable participation support historically excluded households to overcome the many structural barriers to participating in housing decisions. This includes resources for childcare and translation, as well as real estate education and conflict resolution training. Similarly, more expansive participation requires mechanisms for preventing exclusion, like limiting the power of aesthetic design review. Without safeguards, democratic processes risk co-optation by exclusionary politics. The rest of our report covers examples of each of the policy mechanisms discussed, as well as cultural, legal, and financing barriers to realizing social housing in California. As California launches its study of social housing and mediates between competing stakeholders, we offer this framework as a resource for developing resilient, equitable, and transformative social housing policies.